Kuro, Child of Dragons, Episode 10, Underworld. I introduce to you the Underworld. In the main game, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, the Black Mortal Blade could open up a gate to the Underworld, which is how Ishin Ashina was revived by Genichiro. This is that place. Aside from lacking any and all of my usual text and text bars, this episode is pretty much ready to be viewed. As should be quite clear, everything is not okay here. There is an immediate sense of dread, and for story reasons that you are not privy to yet, the danger here is immense. Armed with his trusty golden sword, our main character Kuro will traverse this dark new reality and face the dangers intent on his life. The skeleton sisters that Kuro fights are trying desperately to gut Kuro for a good reason, though admittedly the reason becomes more clear in the coming episodes. After ending the life of that last skeletal foe, Kuro would follow his knees, water submerging his ankles, He wanted to close his eyes to wake up from this dream, but a part of him was unconvinced that this was a dream. It was too real. But how could a place be? Kuro wanted to vomit. He had faced death in the eye, figuratively and literally, and he had brought it to them. The thought of ending another's life, it still did bring nausea to him, even after all this time. He was nothing if not terrified. But then he remembered something, a little boy's words. "He's so strong. I wish I was." The words of a boy mourning the death of his shinobi, words that had started it all. He sat and allowed that time to wash over him, a slight reprieve from the sinister blackness of which he felt to be as much a threat as the two dead sisters that lay beside him. Came an inquisitive and curious voice. Kuro had been so certain he'd been alone, and yet he remained. The conqueror of Ashina himself, Isshin Ashina, stood beside the boy, the two overlooking the grave of the once beloved shinobi, Wolf. It had been the night before that brought change to all. Hirata Estate had been besieged by bandits, and it was not uncommon for a family to have lost much that night. Family, friends, all gone. The morning after, a funeral was held in remembrance. The Hirata Estate, once a proud home to many, now practically a graveyard of Hirata and Ashina alike. While there were those that harbored ill will towards those of the Ashina clan, of which had arrived well after the carnage had taken place, their disdain was docile in comparison to their revulsion at a certain shinobi. Wolf, the divine heir shinobi, when he'd been needed most, he'd vanished. "Ah, I see." Kuro warily met the eyes of the tall man, eyes embedded in scars unending. He trembled a little. In response, Isshin leveled himself with the boy, his body cracking under the effort. "The shinobi, Wolf," Isshin replied. "The bonds that tie us together are so deeply amusing, don't you think?" Kuro was unable to respond. How could he? He looked down, and his attention once again rested on the grave of his beloved shinobi, a small chunk of rock, incense lit beside it, amid thousands others. A conqueror and a child would sit alone, overlooking the graveland for a while yet. "What is it you wish to know?" Unlike the boy's beloved shinobi, he hadn't even had the decency to combat the forces that wrought havoc here. Was he no better? He hadn't even had the decency to die here. There was pain in his voice. Was it guilt? Perhaps, but there was resolve too, a desire to make things right. Kuro had turned to face the man, and what he saw surprised him. His resolve reflected back like a mirror. A time of instruction spent in the service of training to be as strong as he at one point needed to be. Now it would help him out of this pit and back into the light. Kuro would traverse the dark reality he'd woken up in. Cloaked in blackness, he gradually surveyed the scene and took in his surroundings. Ahead were winding paths, gaping vistas lit only by torchlight, and a tremendous nothingness stretching further than could be seen. It did nothing if not frighten him, but he cautiously pressed on. Indeed, he would do what must be done. Eventually, Kuro would come across a candle-lined clearing, though not before wading through groups of decrepit faces. They saw him for what he was, and they were afraid. None dared approach the child, unlike the two skeletal sisters long behind. This did strike him as odd, but he didn't intend to pry. In truth, he had tried his best to slip past unseen, but they just knew he was there. Inside, a statue rested motionless at the center, as if gazing into him just as the others did. It made no motion to him, though. Kuro shuddered at the sight of this warrior's great weapon, a massive halberd. He cautiously picked a path around the great statue, careful to avoid drawing undue attention to himself. Like the rest, he could feel that this being knew of his existence here, but as to its inactivity, well, Kuro was none too eager to ponder as to why. Opposite the entrance of the candle-lined place stood a set of two ornately designed doors, enormous in size, construction starkly different from anything he'd seen in his lifetime. Gently, he pressed his hands to the gold-colored material and set the doors in motion. He'd only taken his eyes off the statue for but a moment, but when it returned to his vision, he noticed that the statue had raised its head and was looking off into the distance, the way he'd come. He froze, and for a time, All that could be heard was the movement of a nearby stream and whatever else resided in these parts. Trembling slightly, he grasped the hilt of his weapon firmly. The sound of rock grinding rock was audible as the stone man turned its head to meet his. Gleaming red eyes met his own. "Ah, you ignorant slaves. Finally taken notice, have you? It was a demonic being, not human, of the power of my beloved child of dragons. Well, I will not give him up." It grasped the weathered staff, "for he is all that I have." The being turned to face an intruder unseen, save for a hulking hunk of metal. The vision faded, and Kuro was left rubbing his face, averting his gaze from those of the statue. It was time to leave. He booked it through the open doors, gaze never again falling on the statue. Kuro would see no other face, save for the face of one so old, a woman, or so he thought it might be. In truth, Kuro would glimpse this face everywhere and nowhere, perhaps not at all. He did not know. It was at the apex of a dream, more like. You look closer and the thing disappears or morphs into something unlike what was before. In time, he simply sat at the steps of a great stone structure, most of which was fully engulfed in blackness. How much time had passed since he'd made it here? How could he know? He'd long since lost that trail. Kuro stopped to think. How did he get here? He remembered the flames. They had overtaken him, consumed him. As much as he had tried to dampen their fury, even he was no match for that of the great shinobi owl. He had been alive all this time. What did that mean? He rested his face in his hands. Reports of what had happened that night Hirata Estate fell claimed that the great shinobi owl had been overwhelmed by bandit forces just outside the walls of the estate itself. Was that all a lie? His mind returned to the moment both their blades clashed. Did he know? No, I've been careful. All the spies were accounted for. Kuro found himself voicing his concerns to that of the abyss that loomed around him. But why would he have interest in the blood if he was unaware of the demon of the dragon? Would immortality truly have... He trailed off, a thought occurring to him. Owl had mentioned to him, "You are the demon that ravaged Ashina, aren't you?" His eyes widened. Of course. How could he forget? He knew, but how? Owl was around then, at that time. What would Genichiro... Suddenly, steps could be heard at the foremost of the structure before him. Kuro raised his blade and turned to face a shadowy figure. Well, fancy that. A lost lamb wandereth here, and with but a single toll of the bell. It was her, the face in the dark. Now having a better look at the woman, she wore dark red garbs, cape obscuring her face. She frowned. A malicious sort thou art. He realized he'd unconsciously lowered himself and his blade into an ideal position for combat and attack. Against his better judgment, Kuro sheathed his blade as an answer, though his right hand still hovered near the hilt. This seemed to please the maiden. "Ah, well met then." She offered a frail white hand. "What can this old handmaiden provide thee?" When Kuro didn't respond, she simply looked at him with a mix of curiosity and an unending delight, as if his mere presence brought no end of interest. She smiled and responded with words that brought ice to his already chilled spine. "To skirt the curse's grasp, tarry not for long." She looked out to the endless blackness far beyond. "'Tis dark for now, and not a soul stirs. But remember, fires are known to fade in quiet." She once again turned her attention entirely to him. "Or perhaps thou art captive already, like the poor girl." She let out an ill-natured cackle of a laugh, no regard given to how it would appear to her now trembling audience. And she was no more. The only being he'd had the displeasure of meeting here had left without a trace, and for a time he'd relished speaking to her again, the words of anyone being preferred to none at all, and such thoughts only became more powerful when through the darkness, the way he'd come, his eyes settled on a single figure, a massive figure, not so unlike the statue from before, carrying what? A hulking hunk of metal? Kuro on instinct reached for his sword, but failed to even grasp the hilt. He blinked once, then twice, attempting to provide some clarity for his rapidly failing senses, but to no avail. Seeing this, the figure immediately charged the boy with an almost animal-like ferocity, the hulking mass of metal trailing behind him, scraping the stairs in its wake. There was nothing to be done. He couldn't move. From the hands of a terrible monster, a sword that could be described as none other than a great sword struck, and the atmosphere of the underworld all fell away.